Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I'll tell you what, this is getting old quick. I'm just grabbing a snack real quick, sorry. If you're wondering what this is, it's just avocado slices on corn to you. Yeah, Brenda, they took down the live, which always happens. I appealed and it came right back. They just put it back up. So what happens is somebody reports your video for hate speech. I think this one was for hate speech. And of course, I didn't say anything hateful about anybody. Somebody says, where do you get your information from? I've been studying this conflict for 34 years. I've read about 10 books on the subject, including ones that are very pro-Israel. I have watched hundreds of hours of debates, podcasts, YouTube videos, as the internet's come to be. And I've had thousands of conversations with people about this, both pro and against Israel. So that's where I get my information from. Try to be as informed as I can. I really don't want to take a side. I've made plenty of videos where I said if the parties were switched and if there was an Arab state that had been created and all the same circumstances occurred, I would be critical of the Arab government's behavior because of how outrageous it's been. But I understand that some people see it differently. If somebody was on the Arab side of this and they said, well, these people deserve it because of our security needs come first, you can make that argument. I would just disagree with that argument. So, yeah, here's what happened, just for those of you. So I was on live here today earlier, probably around 3:30 p.m., and it came down for what's called hate speech on this account. Then I go to my backup account, and we start doing some stuff, and that gets taken down. So this has happened. I've had this happen like 21 times or so. It's been a crazy number of. So I think what happens is I think somebody who's in the audience does not like at all what I'm talking about and then reports the video for violating some community guideline. Then you appeal it, and then they review it. They go, there's nothing going on here that's a problem, and they put it back up. Now, I've had other times where they leave a 1-week suspension in place. I don't know. I never really know. I usually talk about the same stuff. And anyway, it is what it is. It's a pain in the ass. Again, I think in terms of what's happening with this landscape, I think we should be expecting more of this, more of the crackdown, censorship, whatever you want to call it. I call it shenanigans. Because like I said, I believe that there's a paid army of people that are out in these spaces doing certain things that try to maintain a certain narrative. And if people are speaking against that narrative, they do their best to try to either counter it or remove it or both. So that's what it is. We're just going to have to deal with it. And I'm going to try to speak to things in ways that are the least inflammatory way possible so we don't get pushed out. But at the same time, I don't know about you, but I just find what's going on to be so egregious and so over the top. It's hard not to reference it that way. And I know people who are pro-Israel feel a certain way. I don't disrespect their viewpoint. I try to understand it better. I went to the pro-Israel rally in D.C., for example. I've read books by Alan Dershowitz, who I don't like, but I try to get into what he thinks about, understand his point of view. I've talked to countless numbers of people that are pro-Israel, both on TikTok and off. And I think I understand their point of view. I just vehemently disagree with it. I think it's very selfish and self-serving and one-sided. And, hey, if you want your team to win and you want to brutalize somebody else in the process, I get it. You want to win. You want to have your life be as good as it can. And you say you care about others, but you really don't if you're doing if you support your government doing those things. I get that. I just think that's a lousy way to be. So that's it. I kind of think that it probably is Zios that are coming here with ill intent and trying to kick people off TikTok as best they can. Because I don't go on other people's lives. I used to, and I would try to be as polite as I could and stay muted. And all they do is bash you. And never once in all of those uncomfortable situations did I ever report somebody's live. Because they weren't doing anything wrong about community guidelines. They were just being, rude. And I would say that, unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of the Zionists that support Israel here, they're rude as hell. They interrupt, they're smug, they're arrogant, they call everybody else brainwashed. I get called brainwashed all the time. And somebody said I was naive. Now, I shared with them, this person's name is Daniela Bloom, I shared with her the video for Anna Balzer, Life in Occupied Palestine. She shared with me several other videos. I watched every single one she sent me. She didn't look at all at the thing I sent her. So the point is, if somebody's unwilling to encounter any other information, they're just going to maintain their point of view and tell me that I'm naive and brainwashed, what am I supposed to do with that person? I look at all the stuff they send me, I review it, I respond accordingly. That's what's called being fair. People are being unfair and expecting me to somehow come to their point of view when they won't even look at anything other than what they want to believe. Okay, somebody wrote in all caps, how would you handle the situation? This is Bubbles Up 12, I think it says. When you say the situation, Bubbles, are you talking about related to the attacks on 10/7 and Israel's response? Like, how would I do it differently? Can you just clarify that, Bubbles Up? I think that's what you mean, but I want to make sure before I start talking about it. I'll wait for Bubbles Up to respond. Well, no, Kitty, I think there's a difference between spending energy on people that are, kind of just too far gone. But I try to have a civil exchange with everybody as best I can. But yeah, there are some people that aren't going to agree no matter what. That's okay. But that and the future. Okay, so let's talk about that then. Okay, so the question from Bubbles Up is this. Okay, there was the attacks of 10/7, and Israel has done what it's done since. We kind of know what that is. And Bubbles Up is asking me, well, how would you do it differently? And then as far as the bigger picture, like what's the solution? Okay, let's go through that. First, let's talk about what happened on 10/7. In fairness, I think anybody who's being fair-minded would look at the events of 10/7, and to the extent that civilians who are unarmed, especially women or children or elderly, who were harmed, injured, or unalived or worse, is worthy of condemnation, and those are war crimes. And whoever did that, whether they were militants or other civilians that got out or whatever it was, those people are war criminals. That should be off limits, in my opinion. And I believe that the ethos that's put out by the leadership includes prohibitions. For whatever reason on that day, some or many did not follow them. Now, maybe there weren't prohibitions discussed with that particular operation. I don't know what was said the day or the morning of that. But I know in general the principles are, men of fighting age, women and children are off limits, and the elderly, they're off limits. That's what I understand the rules to be. But obviously some of that wasn't followed. So, and also when hostages get taken, this is ripping families apart. And so I can understand the anguish and the anger of the suddenness and the pervasiveness and brutality of the attack on 10/7 and how angry that must make people and just, traumatized. So I can empathize with all of that. And I think any good person should acknowledge that. And also just the general living conditions of people in Israel who have to live under constant fear of an attack, what happened on 10/7 or a rocket attack or whatever it might be. I can empathize with that. And if I were to put myself in their shoes and be living in a territory that's somewhere near this particular closed-in enclave, it'd be on my mind. And if I had a shelter I had to scurry into, 5, 6, 7 times a week or whatever it is, I get it. I understand the anger that comes from that and the discomfort and the fear and the anguish and the anxiety that must cause. Okay, I acknowledge all of that because that's being human. Some of the more egregious accusations of more egregious atrocities, there's some ambiguity there. And I've talked about this at length because if you review the footage of what I've been able to come up with, I've dug very hard as I can, and you listen to some of the journalists who did see the footage that was provided by the Israeli government to journalists, a select people to look at, which included GoPro camera footage primarily from the militants and some from the Israeli first responders to document and prove some of the worst behavior that took place that day towards civilians. I will say this, I have seen maybe directly 30 or 40 civilians being directly engaged by the GoPro camera people and not surviving. That doesn't mean that only 30 or 40 had that happen. That's what I've seen on video. And yes, what I've seen is horrible. It's unacceptable. I've seen the results of what appear to be the same thing in terms of people lying around and not moving, which appear to have been done by the same group. Again, I condemn that. And then we see the aftermath of the Israeli response, not clear on who did what, where, and when. But safe to say, I believe there was probably between 500 and 600 innocent civilians that did not survive that day. Some of the other numbers were hit in the crossfire, and some of the other numbers were soldiers. But it was about 1,167 total fatalities that day, as far as I understand it now. Could be more or less. Doing my best to try to be fair to acknowledge that. So that's the first part. And we should acknowledge the pain and suffering that comes from that. That's more than appropriate and reasonable. And then we talk about the response. So I think it's also understandable when somebody attacks you, regardless of the circumstances that preceded it. And you can make arguments about what that is, but let's just look at what happened. You'd be angry and want to get the people that did it first, but also extract some level of revenge. I think that's a normal human reaction to that. So I'm not taking the side of that, but I'm saying I understand it within that context. Now, others have argued, including the Secretary General at the United Nations, that what happened was horrible, as I've just outlined on 10/7, and acknowledged and empathized with the people that were harmed. And the hostages are still being held, and those who died, unfortunately, during the attacks on the different structures inside Gaza. Like 50 or so people, I believe, that met that fate, unfortunately. It would be ideal, and I would prefer to see all the hostages returned unharmed immediately. It would be great to see a cessation of hostilities immediately for the sake of everybody. I think all of those are reasonable things to point out. Here comes the rub. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that as horrible as things were on 10/7, which they were, we all know they did not happen in a vacuum. Now, he said that at the UN, and he was ruthlessly criticized because what some people believe is that there is no next sentence. What happened on 10/7 is viewed in its own way. It's as Rabbi Barclay said when he was talking to Candace Owens, that what happened on 10/7 was a, quote, special kind of evil, nothing against which can be compared. Okay? That's a way to look at it. And I understand his point of view. Because I don't have his beliefs and his allegiances, I don't see it the same way. But I understand and empathize with his choice to view it that way and the way he feels. Now, somebody's feelings does not make it so. A declaration based on feelings and impressions does not make something so. It's a take. My take is, and I think a lot of people's takes have been, and this is not to minimize the suffering of 10/7. It's to objectively analyze the magnitude of the response, to compare it to the harm that was caused on 10/7, and to look at the cumulative loss of life and damage and see if it's proportional and commensurate and justifiable. I think that's a fair thing to do when you're looking at an armed conflict and a response. That's just being an analyst. And so people can accuse you of analyzing it unfairly. I think I'm trying to be as fair as I can to talk about both sides of this equation. Now, if we get into what the response was, we will see that much of it appears to be, from the outside looking in, again, you can try to justify it and paint it in a different light, it appears to be based primarily on collective punishment and revenge against the broader population, which includes women, children, civilians, etc. That had nothing to do with supporting the entity, the militants, or the actions of 10/7. These are normal people living normal lives, getting through the day, doing the same things that all of us do. And they're not involved in politics, or not involved in conflict, or not involved in militarism. They're just people. And yet they're the ones primarily who have suffered at the hands of the response. Now, you can talk about intent. And it's hard to prove intent in many cases. That's why there is a group from South Africa that has approached the International Court of Justice to analyze that very factor, which is incredibly important. If it is provable that someone intentionally targeted civilians with their military actions, or used no care and concern in the process, which is a requirement in the normal, Geneva Convention of conflict, that there needs to be some responsibility on the offensive party to distinguish between and be mindful of the potential harm to civilians. Every nation has to adhere to that. It's not just Israel. So no one's singling Israel out. Other things happen elsewhere. They deserve their own attention. Sure enough. Yes, the people in Qatar siphon money off the Palestinians. I agree. Not germane to this. These are all the counter arguments I hear made when people start to talk about this. So let's let the analysis be what it is. I talked about what happened inside of Israel. Let's talk about what's happening inside of Gaza. So you have a lot of people that weren't involved in this, right? Now, what has the Israeli government done? They said that everybody's culpable, that there's no innocent person in Israel. Many have spoken that way from the Israeli side. Okay, think about that. What if somebody said, because of what the Israeli government has been doing in the West Bank and Gaza periodically for the last X number of years, that every single citizen in Israel is compliant? Even though many politically didn't agree, didn't vote for the different governments who did it, don't support Netanyahu, but everybody's a target now. That would be completely ridiculous, right? But somehow when you flip the script, all Palestinians are somehow culpable because they're Arabs and they support terrorism, right? That's the line. That's what we hear. That, of course, is absurd, but it's being used as the predominant mindset through which to make choices, which are having the impacts that we're seeing, it appears. Now, what has actually happened? We know that somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people, we don't know the exact numbers with the rubble and the confusion, etc., but some huge number, even if it's like 27 or 38 or whatever it is a lot bigger than 500, which is the approximate number of civilian, non-soldier, non-combatant, non-armed individuals that probably were directly engaged and harmed or unalived by the militants on that day. Now you take 30, 40,000 and divide it by 500, and you get between 60 and 80 to 1. Now, that is not a proportional response. Even if you can somehow justify that in every instance what you did was trying to go after a bad guy, that is callous indifference and not taking any care to avoid the loss of civilian life, under the best of interpretations. And with a sharper eye and a keener eye taken into the process, one could discern that in many cases there was no regard whatsoever, and even no targeting of soldiers or militants. It was simply the release of revenge in such a way that it resulted in the unbelievably large number of civilian casualties. And even if there is a bad guy at a hospital or a refugee camp or whatever, it's not justifiable. Sorry about that. My phone turned off. It's not justifiable to drop a 2,000-pound munition on a refugee camp to get one militant where you kill 467 people. That's not justifiable. That's not commensurate with the rules of conflict. And you can claim by that person being there in that facility, he's, quote, using everyone as a human shield. You can make that claim, but guess who's not buying that claim? Any rational, normal, compassionate human being doesn't buy that crap. Okay, so this is where Israel's missing the boat, in my opinion, in terms of understanding the magnitude and the impression that others are have vis-a-vis its choices and responses to what happened on 10/7. From one point of view, if you're thinking strictly out of anger and frustration and shock and all the feelings you're having of whatever came to you on that day and all the hostages, and you just don't care, you're in this rage and you're sort of just letting go with what you want to do in return. I can understand that. I just don't think it's responsible, and I think it's harming Israel's reputation. Look at all the instances that we have seen on film. These aren't testimony. I probably have 60 or 70 videos on this very phone that I'm talking into right now that I've saved. I've been seeing them on TikTok and through Telegram and elsewhere, where there's literally a journalist, and this is a lot of journalists have been unfortunately killed by Israel purposely. But the ones that haven't been, or who had survived at that time, had set up their tripod on the top of an adjacent building, maybe 5 or 6 blocks away. They're pointing it down a strip of land where there were buildings before Israel leveled the entire landscape, and they began their bombing campaign. And these journalists would film what Israel's doing. No leaflets, no phone calls, no texts, no soft tap on top of the building, not all these moral steps that are claimed all the time and all these legal processes, which is unfortunately only used in the most sparing of circumstances. It would be great if they would do it all the time, because that would be congruent with their claims of being moral, but they don't. And you would just see a missile coming out of the sky and hitting the edge of a big 12-story apartment building, and the whole thing falls. And there's instance after instance after instance after instance. You'd get tired of hearing me say it if I got to the end of the list. So I'm happy to provide some of that for those of you who doubt my view. Let's get on Telegram together. I will send you the videos. I have a Telegram channel. It's just my name. It's just @ChipBarnes. So if you want to message me, or you can message my email, which is chipbarnesonline@gmail.com. I don't lie. And I will send you every single video that I have if you want to see each one. So you do with that as you choose. But I will say this, to make the argument that that is a careful avoidance of civilian casualties, that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, that they go out of their way to avoid civilian casualties, that is 100% horseshit. And you can use whatever term you want. But that's my term. And so with that in mind, Everything we're seeing the Israelis do, and by the way, just so you know, the world is seeing this. If you think somehow you're being slick and these talking points that are somehow going around to justify this, like, oh, we got to do it, the H group's got to go, the world is not buying it. Maybe some of your more ardent supporters chew on that propaganda and go, yeah, yeah, yeah. But most people see the images, the receipts, the proof. And the proof is in video. Video doesn't lie. And you're telling a story, telling the world, hey, these are just bad guys. They're embedding themselves. They're forcing these people. And everybody's going, dude, there's tunnels. If I'm a militant and I know that my enemy is relentlessly bombing multi-story residential property, guess where the one place is I'm not going to go? Multi-story residential property. Because I want to fight the enemy, not get killed and die as a quote-unquote martyr and take down 35 of my citizens with me. What sense does that make? There are third graders listening to that and laughing on the playground. So, with that said, if we're going to analyze both fairly and empathize with both equally as human beings, not as adversaries and angry people, the revenge-oriented approach, which has taken the lives of so many thousands of people, in my mind, drastically unnecessarily, the immiseration of a population that's been mostly moved out of their homes are destroyed, they've been made refugees and have been stuffed into this small little fifth at the southern end of this little strip that was already one of the most densely populated things on earth. Now they're crammed into a space that's 1/5 the size of that populated area. So they're all there, and now the homicidal maniac leader of the country is saying, against every recommendation on earth by every party, including the United States, who is supplying all the money, the munitions, the military and political cover for this genocidal act, is now claiming he's going to proceed and go in and start attacking this incredibly densely populated with civilians, seemingly with no concern at all. Because he's got one focus, and that is trying to utterly destroy and eliminate an entire group of militants. But what he doesn't understand, and I don't believe people who support Israel understand, is that there's a natural human trait that's called, I don't want to be occupied and oppressed by somebody. Okay, if somebody comes to your house and locks you in the basement, guess what you want to do? You want to get out of the basement, right? Somebody is holding you against your will. If somebody comes to your house with a gun and makes you leave, you're not happy about that. If somebody periodically comes in and knocks down the home you're living in and takes your 12-year-old son and sticks him in a jail and says you're administratively detained for 3 months, 4 years, whatever it may be, you're not too happy about that. If somebody comes into your living area and pours gasoline on your olive tree grove and pours cement into your water wells or cuts your water lines or bulldozes your home or shoots your son or makes your father undress in a raid in front of your whole family to humiliate him, etc., 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 you're not too happy about that. And if you're living under those conditions, the natural human reaction is to want to change those conditions. And if you try with every other option to peacefully do that, and there's no resolution that's favorable, then what is one to do? And what people do in those circumstances is they try to find a way to go break the basement door, as you would, hopefully, not being a fool and just sit there in perpetuity and take it. And you ask them nicely, can I please go? They say, nope, not going to happen. Well, can I at least have, nope, not going to happen. And so what do you do? When they come down one time and they try to smack you in the head for the 15th time, you smack them back. And then they call you a terrorist for hitting them back after all the shit they've done to you and all the stuff they've, all the pain and suffering that you've gotten. And they say they have to do that because I've known people of your type who may have done that stuff, so you got to be punished. You're like, what? So this is the mindset, and this is the type of thing that these people have had to deal with forever. And therefore, they are not happy about it, nor would you be. Now, we know people that were living in some of the harsh conditions in Germany during World War II, during the systematized approach to what the horrific regime did versus Jewish people, never to be, acknowledged as anything other than one of the worst catastrophes in human history. I advocate, and so should others, for anybody who tries to break free from those conditions, including uprisings in places like the Warsaw Ghetto. Why wouldn't we support people who are trying to get out of those circumstances? And likewise and consistently, why wouldn't we support someone who's trying to break free from persistent, violent oppression and being walled in and contained, never allowed to leave? Goods can't come in and out without somebody saying so. You can't go out and fish past a certain point. Your whole lives are messed with. They shoot at fishing boats. They periodically, because of the rocket fire, come in and absolutely destroy the place and unalive 1,500 people casually don't seem to care. And they do that frequently. Every few years, they just decide to do it because they're mad at rockets, 99.99997 of which get knocked down by a system called the Iron Dome that the U.S. funds, and it's $36,000 per fired air defense piece that we pay for Israel. So I'm glad that people aren't being hit with the rockets. And over the course of all the rockets that have ever been fired over the course of 15, 20 years, 10 people have been unalived on the Israeli side. Meanwhile, if you do a count of how many Palestinians have been unalived by the Israelis through its brutal occupation and its incursions into Gaza, etc., it's in the 12 to 15,000 number. Add to that those that were unalived during the Nakba, the forcible dispossession of land in 1948, and you have another 14,800 on that total. That's over 30,000. Add in the current conflict, you have over 75,000 human beings that Israel has unalived. Guess how many Israelis in total have died? 3,900 approximately. 70,000, 3,900. Now, I'm not a math genius, but 70,000 is a lot more than, it's like 19 or 18 times the number of Israelis who have died. I don't want anybody to die. But to claim somehow that this is an equal fight is absurd. It's a slaughter. Yeah, listen, I think one is too many, David. David Farley says that 3,900 is too many Israelis. Well, maybe the number's not exact right. I don't have my math perfect, but it's some really disproportionate number. You can check. I mean, we can look it up. But the point is that this has been an ongoing disaster for a group of people that have, yes, they've responded in ways that have been horrible over the years, especially in the 80s under Arafat, the PLO. They had people going into Israel and do some pretty horrible things. I don't agree with doing those things. I don't want to see civilians hurt. And listen, you may say that under any circumstances, those things shouldn't happen, no matter how much you're suffering. I can see that point of view, but I'm not one to tell other people under their plight what they should or shouldn't do. That's not my place. My place is to try to evaluate it, acknowledge it, try to make sense of it, and try to figure what's what. And people say I'm biased. Listen, like I said, if the script were flipped, I would be criticizing an Arab government for doing what it's doing to displace Jewish people. It's just the roles are just switched. That's it. No more, no less. Now, a lot of people say that what the H group did on 10/7 was based on abject hatred, that it's going to continue because they say it's going to continue, and all they do is hate Jewish people, and they want to push them into the sea, they want to take all the land back, they want to get rid of all the Jewish people. But this I don't believe to be true. Now, what do I base that on? People say, oh, the charter, 1988, these people say in their charter they want to get rid of all. Yeah, they said some pretty horrible things in their 1988 charter. However, they amended that charter in 2017 to eliminate all of that genocidal language, which I think is a good thing. Now, might there be some militants who are still hardcore and want to do the things that were originally? Probably. But I don't think that's a commonly held feeling. In fact, I've talked to a lot of people, and I've asked people at different places, hey, what are your thoughts towards Jewish people? Where do they fit into your belief system? Do you hate people who are Jewish? Do you begrudge people who are Jewish? And they're like, no. We could care less about somebody being Jewish or Christian or whatever you are, ethnically or religiously. We just don't want to be dispossessed of our land, and we just want a fair and equitable chance to live our lives with dignity, respect, and autonomy. That's it. Nothing more. They don't care if Jewish people live in the country. They don't care who it is. Just don't oppress us. Don't oppress us. But as long as you oppress people and you unalive them and you brutalize them because they dare to fight back periodically, it will never foster a peaceful outcome. Therein lies the problem. Now, Arka Rasha says, you don't know anything. Listen, I appreciate that. So the fact that I don't know anything, how about if we pick one thing? I can't even read your name. It's Ark Dirashba. That's fair. That's fair to point that out. I could be completely ignorant. But what I would prefer that we do, Ark Rashba, is that let's cover one point, pick anything that I've said, and let's pick it apart, and you can educate me on whatever it is you feel I'm missing. And if I can make heads and tails of it, I will certainly agree with you and update the way I view things accordingly. I think that's a fair approach, right? But absent any sort of specificity, I think it's kind of hard to adjudicate comments like that because where are you going with it? What are you talking about? The bigger picture? Are you talking about the conflict? What are you talking about? Okay? So what I would invite you to do is either come up and talk, or if you want to put your thoughts in the comments, I'm happy to try to do the best I can to interface with you. But general comments about not understanding the history or being stupid or ignorant or you don't know anything, that's kind of a worthless statement. It's very empty and lacks specificity or any sort of germane or valid argument. So I just ask you to come with some goods that make sense so we can, and listen, if the audience can understand what you're saying and it makes sense to all of us, then we're of course going to say, hey, that's a good point. You bring up a good point. Somebody the other day, believe it or not, and people think I don't listen to people. I really do give people the floor and listen. There was somebody the other day I had on here. His name was something Cowboy, or Cowboy Archaeologist, I think was his name. And his style was very, had a very unique way of communicating. Well, I wasn't crazy about it, but I let him say whatever he wanted to. And he brought up some fair points, I thought, about the 1967 war, the stuff that preceded it, that were, not illegitimate arguments. Everyone has to weigh where things fit together, but he made some points that I thought were fair. And that's what we want to do. We want to have a fair and honest dialogue with substance, and then hopefully the audience can decide, and we can hopefully, if we listen to each other, we can update our opinions. And that's the way we should be. Okay, we have a couple of guests in the queue. Actually, we have Revolution 69. I'm going to bring you up in just a second, Revolution. Thanks for being patient. So I would invite anybody, especially, I think these conversations are much more useful rather than being in an echo chamber. We have the opportunity to go back and forth on some issues. I think it's very engaging. So if there is anybody who, there's somebody named Fauzi.
Yo, why we have two people on the live, man? That's when you open up your Oh, 3 crafty abs, garden plate, sweet fry. Yes, sir.
Came up, guys. I can't just say.
Get a little more color. Maybe the other side.
I know,
Good to go.
Guys, sorry.